The Book of Daniel. An Introduction to Daniel by Ray C. Stedman. Almost everyone looks at the Book of Daniel with a sense of wonder and anticipation, because this is usually regarded as a prophetic book foretelling the future. This is true. The Book of Daniel, together with the Book of Revelation, marvelously unfolds future events as God has ordained them in the program of history. By no means has this book yet been fulfilled. Neither has the book of Revelation. These two books, one from the Old and one from the New Testament, remarkably complement each other in their symmetry and harmony. The book of Revelation explains the book of Daniel. The book of Daniel lays the basis for the book of Revelation. If you would like to know God's program for the future, it is essential that you understand this book of Daniel. But knowledge of the future can be a very dangerous thing. Imagine what would happen if any or all of us possessed the ability to know what is going to happen in the days ahead. Think of what an advantage that would give us in the stock market, in the buying of insurance, and in other practical matters of life. By and large, God does not unfold the future to us. Certainly not in detail, and certainly not any individual's future. But what He does show us in the prophetic scriptures is the general trends of events, and where it will all end. Anyone who investigates this area thoughtfully, carefully, and scripturally will discover significant and helpful things about what is happening in our world today. Everything that is happening is working out God's purposes on earth. These will all end exactly as God foretold. We can understand what is happening today if we know what the prophetic program is. God has taken two precautions in this matter of unveiling the future. First, He has clothed these prophetic passages in symbolic language. He has given them to us in figurative form. That is why in these prophetic books unusual things appear. Strange beasts with many different heads and horns sticking out here and there, and images of all kinds, and other indescribable visions. You have something in the book of Revelation, bizarre beasts with strange combinations of characteristics. These have always puzzled people. You can't just sit down with the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation and read them through and understand them as you would a novel. You have to study them. Take the whole of the Bible to interpret the symbols in the books of Daniel and Revelation. This is one of the locks that God has provided to keep curious minds from getting into these books without an adequate background in Scripture. You cannot understand what is going on in them without first knowing a great deal about the rest of the Bible. These symbolic things are signs erected by God, and signs are given to us so that we may understand facts that are otherwise hidden. God's program for the future is hidden from us until we spend time understanding the signs, and these books are full of signs. A second precaution God has taken in Daniel, and even more especially in the book of Revelation, is that He doesn't introduce the prophetic section first, but brings us through 6 chapters into an understanding of the moral character He requires of the reader before the prophetic program can begin to make sense. In other words, you can't understand the last section of Daniel unless you have lived through and understood what is involved in the first 6 chapters. There's no way to understand what the prophetic program means unless you first grasp the moral lessons of the first part of the book. There's no way to cheat on this. You can't just read it through and then turn the prophetic program hoping to understand. You will find you will get nothing out of it. You really have to carefully analyze these initial chapters. Think them through. Begin to walk accordingly and experience them before the prophetic program comes to life. That is the glory of God's book. You can't understand it with just intellect. You can sit down with the prophetic outlines of Daniel and of Revelation, draw charts, Spend your time explaining to people what all these things mean and how God's program is going to work out, and analyze it down to a gnat's eyebrow. But unless you have incorporated these lessons of the first part of the book into your own life, you will discover that there's nothing there to enrich your life. The Lord Jesus himself points this out during the Olivet Discourse, when his disciples asked him to name the sign of his coming and what the symbol of his return to earth would be. Jesus said, "So when you see the desolating sacrilege spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." Matthew 24, verses 15 and 16. Get out of the city of Jerusalem, because things will happen there that will tremendously affect the people living in that area. Then is the time to flee the city, for the great tribulation will be upon you. When he said, "When you see the desolating sacrilege standing in the holy place," he added in parenthesis these words, "Let the reader understand." That is, don't read through Daniel superficially. Think it through. Give yourself to thought on this. You have to understand what he is talking about before you will be able to recognize the desolating sacrilege, or abomination of desolation, when it comes. That is why the Lord went on to say that the world, in its superficial approach to truth, will not understand when it cries, "Peace, peace, peace," for there will be no peace. Sudden destruction will come upon them, and they will be swept away, just as the people of Noah's day were swept away when the flood came. Now, all of this is a warning to take the book of Daniel seriously, and to endeavor to understand the structure of this book as we delve into it. This book divides very simply into two sections, as I have already suggested. The first 6 chapters are a history of the prophet Daniel himself and his friends in the land of Babylon, men of faith in a hostile world. Let me tell you that there is no section of Scripture more helpful to understand someone who is trying to live as a Christian in difficult surroundings than these 6 chapters of Daniel. If you are working in a company surrounded by a godless crowd who are taking the name of God in vain every moment, who agree with the ideas and attitudes of the world and its ways, and who make fun of the things of God, show little interest in what God has to say to mankind, then I suggest that you read carefully the book of Daniel. The first 6 chapters are for you if you're a teenager going to school, where you are surrounded constantly by those who seem to have no interest in what God is like, or in the things of God. Daniel and his friends were themselves teenagers when they were first taken captive by Nebuchadnezzar and carried off to the land of Babylon. As they began their career of faith, they did so with a total lack of understanding of life and with all the insecurity of a teenager in a hostile environment. The book records in these first 6 chapters the pressure they underwent as they stood for their faith in the midst of these difficult surroundings. In chapter 1, the young men are confronted with the necessity of changing their diet. Ordinarily, there would be nothing particularly significant in that. Many of us could stand that, perhaps frequently. But these young men already had been told by God what they are not to eat. And the very things that they were told not to eat are the things that are required eating from them as prisoners in the palace of the king of Babylon. What are they to do? This king is the most powerful tyrant who shall ever have lived on earth. The Bible itself records that there was no king that had ever lived before Nebuchadnezzar or would ever live after him who was equal to him in authority. There were no restraints whatsoever upon what he desired to do. His word was absolute law. He could take any man's life at any time. Later on in his reign, he took the lives of the sons of the king of Judah as their father watched, and then had the father's eyes put out. Another man was burned to death over a slow fire. This king was an expert in torture. So these young teenagers, facing this test, know that they will have to either comply with the king's demands or forfeit their lives. What can they do? They feel all the pressure and hear all the familiar arguments that any person hears today to try to get them to give up acting on the basis of faith. They surely hear the argument, in whatever form it took in those days, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. Everyone else is doing this. What difference does it make what you eat? So what if you have a ham sandwich with these Babylonians? What's the difference? After all, they're prisoners in a country far away from home. Their own country has been laid waste. Who will know or care what they do? They feel the pressure, but these young men stand fast, and God honors them. God gives them the grace to stand despite that pressure, and as a result, they are exalted and given positions of authority and responsibility in that kingdom. This story of repeated pressure goes right on throughout this book. In chapter 2, we see part of the reason for this kind of testing for these particular young men. It comes out more clearly here in the story of the great dream vision of King Nebuchadnezzar. He dreams one night of a great image of a man with a strange body. He had a head of gold, shoulders of silver, midsection of brass, legs of iron, and feet of clay and iron mixture. But he forgets his dream. He calls in the wise men and asks them to tell him not only the interpretation, but the dream as well. I've often wondered if this wasn't the beginning of that popular song, "You tell me your dream, and I'll tell you mine." The astrologers and the soothsayers and the sorcerers of Babylon are totally unable to come up with anything. Obviously, if the king can't tell them the dream, then they can't dream up an interpretation. Thus, their lives are forfeit. Daniel is placed in the middle of this situation. Again, God's man is pressured and threatened with death if he does not conform. Again, God's man comes through, as he always does when he is willing to stand and obey God despite the pressures. God overrules in the affairs of men. Life is never determined by mere superficial pressures. The outcome that seems logically inevitable as you face a situation is not necessarily the outcome that will happen if you are trusting in the invisible God who rules the affairs of men. And that is the great lesson of this book all the way through. You find it beautifully expressed by Daniel in his prayer to God in chapter 2. "Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, to whom belongs wisdom and might. He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and mysterious things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him." Chapter 2, verses 20 through 22. If you are in touch with a God like that, you don't need to worry about what the crowd is doing. For that same God is able to carry you through and to work the situation out no matter how impossible it looks. That is exactly the story of Daniel, repeated 5 different times through these first 6 chapters. And God gives to Daniel and his friends the privilege of obliging the most powerful man on earth to recognize the overall government of God. Do you know that this is exactly the position every believer is placed in today? The world lives with the idea that there is no God, or if he does exist, he has no real power. He doesn't do anything. He doesn't change history. He doesn't affect human lives. He doesn't enter into situations and make any difference. He is a great old man in the sky, off there somewhere, who really doesn't affect anything that happens down here. That is the world's philosophy. But every believer is put into a position in which, if they walk faithfully, if they obey what God says despite the pressures that are put upon them, they are given the privilege of opening the eyes of men to the fact that God exists, that he is not dead, that he is at work in the affairs of men, and that he is a power to be reckoned with. In chapter 3, you have the story of the fiery furnace. The young men are commanded to bow down before the image which Nebuchadnezzar erected, pridefully thinking of the image in his dream. Because he was told that he represented the head of gold, that he was the great king of earth, in pride he lifted himself up and caused an image to be erected on the plain. It was a huge image, as tall as some of our rockets that we shoot into the sky, and the whole crowd is gathered on the plain, with these 3 young men among them. All are ordered to bow down and worship the image. In order to encourage them, a great furnace was built at the other end of the plain, and they are told that if they don't bow down, that is where they will end. Now that is a lot of pressure for young people to bear, and they have some additional inducements as well. There is a band, and what a band! The instruments are given to us, and we don't even recognize the names of all of them. When the band plays, the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every other kind of instrument, everyone falls down and worships. All except the 3 young men. When they are brought before Nebuchadnezzar, he orders them to fall down. Then they say these wonderful words, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter." Chapter 3, verse 16. They are not being impertinent. They mean they do not need to take any time to think over their answer. We do not need to take any counsel. We know what to say. If it be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, chapter 3, verse 1. Those are words of faith. But if not. Our God is able to, but we don't know the mind of God. His thoughts are greater than our thoughts. His ways are different than ours. It may be that he won't do it at all. But even if he doesn't, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods, nor worship the golden image which you have set up. Chapter 3, verses 17 and 18. Now these are young men who have learned that these things are more important than life. It is better to be dead and obedient to God than alive and disobedient to him. It is far more profitable to the individual concerned to walk with God at the cost of life itself than to be disobedient to what God has said. God will never be in any man's debt. Therefore, he greatly honors these young men. As a result, they come out of the fiery furnace without even the smell of fire upon them. You know the record. What an amazing story that is. Then in chapter 4, you have the conversion of Nebuchadnezzar. Did you know that this whole chapter is the testimony of the greatest king that ever lived, the greatest tyrant that ever ruled? It is a story of how God broke the pride of his heart, humiliated him, humbled him, allowed him to exercise his pride until it resulted in what always results when men live in pride: madness. He went out and ate grass in the field for 7 years. His throne was preserved, but he acted like an animal. This is what always happens to man when he chooses to walk out of the fellowship with the living God. He becomes animal-like, beastly, brutish. King Nebuchadnezzar became like an animal. Then the king tells how his reason was restored to him by the grace of God. And his closing word in this chapter is a great testimony of faith, of how God humbled him and brought him back. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are right, and his ways are just, and those who walk in pride he is able to abase. Chapter 4, verse 37. Who brought him to this? Humanly speaking, it was Daniel and his friends. 4 young men were used of God to win the heart of the greatest king of the greatest empire the world has yet seen. Now look at chapter 5. Here is the story of the handwriting on the wall, the familiar story of King Belshazzar. Note the luxury and licentiousness and the lust of that kingdom. A deteriorating kingdom, yet in the midst of it, Daniel, having lived through 3 empires, is still prime minister. God uses him to interpret the strange figure of the hand that appears and writes upon the wall. The judgment of God upon that licentious king. This bears out the thesis of this book, that God is at work in the affairs of men, and any man who sees beyond the things that are seen to the things that are unseen and acts accordingly will find that God is with him, supporting him and strengthening him along the way, bringing him out to the praise of his glory. Chapter 6 tells of the lion's den, but it is the same story told in still another way. Darius throws Daniel into the lion's den, but God sent his angel to shut the lions' mouths. Daniel is brought out again, delivered by the hand of God. Chapter 7 begins the prophetic section, starting with the vision of the 4 beasts. It is interesting that these beasts cover the same period of time as the 4 divisions of the image that Nebuchadnezzar had seen in chapter 2. That image had a head of gold, symbolizing the Babylonian kingdom, shoulders of silver for Media-Persia, the trunk of brass symbolizing the Grecian Empire, and then the 2 legs of iron representing the 2 divisions of the Roman Empire, and terminating at last in a broken kingdom characterized by feet of mingled iron and clay. This great prophetic passage outlines history from Daniel's day clear past our own day, to the end of time and the return of Jesus Christ. For as the prophet watches, he sees a stone cut out without a hand strike the image on its feet, utterly demolishing it, and then grow to be a great mountain to fill the earth. Clearly, this pictures the kingdom of God and the return of Jesus Christ. In chapter 7, the 4 beasts represent the same kingdoms, but from God's point of view. They are nothing but beasts growling and fighting and quarreling with each other. I think Dr. Schofield points out all the symbols of modern nations are representations of birds or of beasts of prey. Our own nation is symbolized by an eagle, a bird of prey. The British Empire is a lion. Russia is a bear. The prophet sees these nations struggling together, culminating in the powerful reign of a single individual over the whole of this Western world. Then in chapter 8, you see the movement of Western history. The ram and the he-goat come together, and this is a picture, as we are told later in chapter 11, of the conquest by Alexander the Great and the rise of the kingdom of the Seleucids in Syria, as opposed to the Ptolemies in Egypt. These 2 families occupied the center of history for centuries after that. The struggle between Syria and Egypt, with little Israel caught in the middle. The battle rages back and forth, and today Israel is the most fought-over country in all of history. More battles have occurred in the land of Israel than in any other spot on the face of the earth, and it is in that very same area where the last great battle, the Battle of Armageddon, is yet to be fought. In the midst of this, in chapter 9, is Daniel's wonderful prayer as he pours his heart out to God. The answer to his prayer, in the last section of the chapter, is one of the most remarkable prophecies in all the Bible. The prophecy of the 70 weeks. This is the timetable of prophecy concerning the nation Israel. It gives us the principle that is called the Great Parenthesis. God has interrupted his program for Israel and has inserted between the first coming and the second coming of the Lord Jesus the present age in which we live. This indeterminate period, which has now spanned more than 1900 years, comes between the 69th week of years and the 70th of the prophecy. The 70th week, a week of 7 years, is yet to be fulfilled for Israel. As you read of this, you will see that this is what the book of Revelation and other prophetic passages call the Great Tribulation, or the time of Jacob's trouble. It lies ahead. It has been broken off from the other 69, and it is yet to be fulfilled. Then in chapter 10, the things unseen, which are behind the things that are seen. This is another great revelation of God's sovereign government in the affairs of men, and it is the explanation of the events of history. What causes the things that happen today? Well, there are unseen forces at work, and these forces are here clearly revealed to Daniel. Chapter 11 is one of the most remarkable chapters in the Bible, in that it records prophecy that for the most part has been fulfilled in detail. It foretells the struggle between the king of Syria and the king of Egypt, which took place after Daniel's day. It is prophetically and historically fulfilled. These historic events are described in great detail and cover 200 or 300 years of history. You can see that the prophecies here have been worked out exactly in the pattern of history. Among other outstanding individuals, Cleopatra appears in this chapter, prophetically foretold. When you come to the 36th verse of the 11th chapter, a noteworthy break occurs. It is introduced by the previous verse, in which the angel says to Daniel, "And some of those who are wise shall fall, to refine and to cleanse them and to make them white, until the time of the end, for it is yet for the time appointed." Chapter 11, verse 35. Here begins a passage that deals with the 70th week of Daniel that is yet to be fulfilled, the time of the end, the last days, the ultimate arrangement of earth's kingdoms just before the return of Jesus Christ. This remarkable passage predicts an invasion of Palestine and a counter-invasion from Egypt in the south, and then the meeting of two great armies in the land of Israel, and the ultimate destruction of those armies there on the mountains of Israel. There's also clearly described in the 38th and 39th chapters of Ezekiel and the 2nd chapter of Joel, and you will find other prophetic references to this. The beginning of chapter 12 introduces the greatest event of history yet to be fulfilled, the coming again of Jesus Christ. It is not mentioned as such here, but this is what Daniel hears. "At that time shall arise Michael, the great prince who has charge of your people Israel. And there shall be a time of trouble, such as never has been since there was a nation till that time. But at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone whose name shall be found written in the book." Chapter 12, verse 1. This is followed by a resurrection. "And of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt." Chapter 12, verse 2. And the final judgment of God. "And those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the firmament, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever." Chapter 12, verse 3. Then Daniel is given a sign of when this will occur. "But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase." Chapter 12, verse 4. Many Bible scholars understand this to be an indication that as we near that time, transportation and knowledge will rapidly increase just as they have in our own time. One last thing about the final chapter is important. Daniel asks certain questions of the angel who has revealed this to him, and then he is given to understand two great principles that are at work in human life. You and I often hear people discussing what is happening in the world, with newspaper commentators and others constantly pouring into our ears reports of terrible things. People often say, "What is happening? Is the world getting worse and worse, or is it getting better and better?" On one hand, you will hear people describe things in such a way that you are bound to say, "Well, the world is getting worse and worse." Then someone replies, "No, it isn't. Look at this, and this, and this." I believe the world is getting better. We're progressing. Now, the book of Daniel makes it clear that we will never understand God's word and God's work until we believe both of these principles. For in the 10th verse of chapter 12, Daniel is told, "Many shall purify themselves and make themselves white, and shall be refined. Good will get better. But the wicked shall do wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand. But evil will get worse. But those who are wise shall understand." Chapter 12, verse 10. Jesus said that the good seed has been sown, but the enemy has come and sown tares among the wheat. Let both grow together, he says, until the harvest. Matthew chapter 13, verse 30. I think this is certainly true in history. Today, evil is worse than it has ever been. It is more subtle, more devilish, more satanic, more difficult to detect than it has ever been before in human history. But good is better than it has ever been before. Good is more powerful. Its effect in human history in relationship to the evil around it is far greater than it has ever been before. These two principles are at work in human society, but neither shall overpower the other. Good is not going to become so triumphant that evil finally disappears, as once was thought at the turn of the century. Nor is evil going to be so powerful that good finally disappears. Both are going to come into a headlong conflict, and the Bible everywhere records that at that precise moment in history, God shall again intervene in human affairs. Of the ultimate clash of these two great principles working in human society, Daniel is told, "Blessed is he who waits and comes to the 1,335 days. But go your way until the end, and you shall rest, and shall stand in your allotted place at the end of the days." Chapter 12, verses 12 and 13. Daniel, chapter 1. Timeline. During the 6th century BC, construction on the Acropolis in Athens begins. Mayan civilization was flourishing in Mexico. Aesop wrote his fables. Confucius and Buddha live. Greek art comes into its own. The Phoenicians make the first known sea journey around Africa. The olive tree is introduced to Italy by the Greeks. Daniel in the den of the higher critics. Who wrote the book of Daniel? The author mostly speaks in the third person, except for chapter 8, verse 1, chapter 9, verse 20, and chapter 10, verse 2, where he speaks in the I, Daniel form. But it was customary for ancient writers to speak in the third person, even when writing about themselves. One Old Testament exception to this is Nehemiah, which is in the form of a personal diary. God himself switches between the grammatical first and third person when speaking of himself. Compare Exodus chapter 20, verse 2, "I am the Lord your God," and chapter 20, verse 7, "For the Lord will not hold him guiltless." So clearly, the book of Daniel claims to have been written by Daniel himself, and the fact that it is written mostly in the third person does not contradict that claim. Fortunately, Jesus clears the matter up nicely. He tells us that Daniel wrote the book of Daniel. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, Matthew chapter 24, verse 15, and Mark chapter 13, verse 14. Ezekiel, who was a contemporary of Daniel, knew of him and his godliness. Even if these three men, Noah, Daniel, and Job, were in it, they would deliver only themselves by their righteousness, says the Lord God. That's Ezekiel chapter 14, verse 14. Daniel describes events of the 2nd century before Christ, especially the period 175 to 164 BC, with such precision that critics have held that it had to have been written after that period, during the time of the Maccabees. Supposedly, its purpose for being written during that time was for it to be an inspiring political tract meaning to encourage God's people on to victory during the Maccabean War. The first one to suggest a Maccabean date for Daniel was the Neoplatonic philosopher Porphyrius of Tyre, 3rd century AD. Porphyrius couldn't believe the prophecies, so he suggested the later date. Jerome, in his commentary on Daniel, spent much of his time refuting these arguments. Beginning in 1771, influenced by the Enlightenment, academics began to revive the old Maccabean date theory for Daniel. They all agreed that every accurate prediction of Daniel was written after the event had taken place. The modern argument is based on supposed inevitable mistakes that a 2nd century BC writer would make when writing about a period 400 years before, in the 6th century BC. In our own day, it would be as if someone wrote a story about the Pilgrims landing at Plymouth Rock with speedboats and computers. We would know that it was a forgery. There are usually said to be 5 main historical blunders: the wrong date for Nebuchadnezzar's invasion, using the word Chaldeans to describe a class of soothsayers, the obviously legendary account of Nebuchadnezzar's madness, King Belshazzar and his relationship to Nabonidus, and the legendary figure of Darius the Mede. There is also a linguistic argument made saying that the Greek words used in Daniel, words that would not have come into the Hebrew vocabulary until the 2nd century BC. As we go through Daniel, we will give special attention to these issues and what modern archaeological research has to say about them. But we should ask, why such a strong attack against Daniel? Simply because Daniel contains more fulfilled prophecies than any other book in the Bible. In New Testament prophecy, Daniel is referred to more than any other Old Testament book. Marxist governments have prohibited preaching from passages like Daniel because they tell God's words on the course of history where He and His people win. Daniel chapter 1, verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem, and besieged it. Daniel chapter 1, verse 2. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. Nebuchadnezzar conquers Jerusalem. Jehoiakim was a Judean king, placed on the throne by Pharaoh Necho of Egypt. His name, Jehovah Raises Up, belied his illegitimate ascendancy. Nebuchadnezzar is a Hebrew transliteration of the Babylonian name Nebu-Kudurri-Utsur, which means Nebu protects the crown. Why did Nebuchadnezzar come down against Jerusalem? Because the Pharaoh of Egypt invaded Babylon. The young prince Nebuchadnezzar defeated the Egyptians at Carchemish. Then he pursues the fleeing Egyptian army all the way down to the Sinai. Along the way, or on the way back, he subdued Jerusalem, which had been loyal to the Pharaoh. This, 605 BC, was the first but not the last encounter between Nebuchadnezzar and Jehoiakim. There would be 2 later invasions, 597 and 587 BC. Is this a historical blunder? This invasion in 605 BC is not mentioned in the Book of Kings, but Josephus' quoting of the Babylonian historian Berosus shows that the biblical account of there being 3 separate Babylonian attacks on Judah is accurate against Apion 1:19, Antiquities 10:11 and 1. The Babylonian Chronicles are a collection of tablets discovered as early as 1887 and are held in the British Museum. In them, Nebuchadnezzar's 605 BC presence in Judah is documented and clarified. When the Babylonian Chronicles were finally published in 1956, they gave us detailed political and military information of the first magnitude for the first 10 years of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. These tablets were prepared by L.W. King in 1919. Then he died, and they were neglected for 4 decades. The victory of Nebuchadnezzar over the Egyptians at Carchemish in May or June of 605 is also documented by excavations. They found evidences of battle, vast quantities of arrowheads, layers of ash, and a shield of Greek mercenary fighting for the Egyptians. This campaign was interrupted suddenly when Nebuchadnezzar heard of his father's death and had to race back to Babylon to secure his succession to the throne. He traveled about 500 miles in 2 weeks. Remarkable speed for the time. The siege of Jerusalem in 605, which was cut short by this news, is not specifically detailed in the Babylonian Chronicles, but is entirely consistent with the record. There is also no contradiction between Daniel, who says this happened in the 3rd year of Jehoiakim, and Jeremiah chapter 46 verse 2, which says that it was in the 4th year of Jehoiakim. Daniel reckons a king's years in the Babylonian method. The first year of a king's reign begins at the beginning of the calendar year after he takes the throne. In the 597 BC deportation, Jehoiakim, Ezekiel, and others were taken away. This deportation is described in 2 Kings chapter 24 verses 14 through 16. In the 587 BC invasion, the city of Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed. 2 Kings chapter 25 verses 9 and 10. God's hand is obvious. He is in command. This was prophesied in Isaiah 39 verse 7. And they shall take away some of your sons who will descend from you, whom you will beget, and they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. This prophecy has led some to think that Daniel and his companions were made eunuchs. Certainly the Hebrew term seres was used of literal eunuchs, but the word derives from a phrase that simply means to be a servant of the king. It wasn't necessarily exclusively applied to eunuchs. 2 main reasons for the captivity: idolatry and Israel's failure to observe the Sabbaths for the land. Leviticus chapter 25 verses 1 to 7 and chapter 26 verses 2 to 35. God always settles his accounts with those who refuse to heed his warnings. Some of the articles of the house of God: Nebuchadnezzar did not take all the furnishings of the temple. The rest were brought to Babylon later. The confiscation of these items and their deposit in a Babylonian temple was a dramatic declaration of the opinion, "My God is better than your God." Would the God of Israel be able to vindicate himself? This was a low time for Judah and God's people. It would seem that the God of Israel had lost to the gods of Assyria, Egypt, and Babylon. Daniel shows God vindicating himself at a time when the conquering of Israel might have brought his reputation into disrepute. Daniel chapter 1 verse 3. And the king spoke unto Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel, and of the king's seed, and of the princes. Daniel chapter 1 verse 4. Children in whom was no blemish, but well favored, and skillful in all wisdom, and cunning in knowledge, and understanding science, such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and tongue of the Chaldeans. Babylon's system of indoctrination. The best and the brightest of Jerusalem's young men are chosen to be taken back to Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar not only confiscated holy things from the temple, but the shining lights of Judah's future as well. Young men perhaps 13 to 17 years old. He showed himself as a wise administrator and a shrewd tactician. Taking these young men as hostages would remind the people back in Jerusalem that they should not revolt against recently imposed Babylonian rule. Daniel chapter 1 verse 5. And the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat, and of the wine which he drank, so nourishing them 3 years, that at the end thereof they might stand before the king. Daniel chapter 1, verse 6. Now among these were of the children of Judah Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Daniel chapter 1, verse 7. Unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave names, for he gave unto Daniel the name of Belteshazzar, and to Hananiah of Shadrach, and to Mishael of Meshach, and to Azariah of Abednego. In Babylon, the Hebrew youths are groomed for the civil service. It was a given that these would be provided for by the government, but to have the same food and wine that was prepared for the king was intended as a special honor. 4 of these youths had their names changed. Daniel, God is my judge, to Belteshazzar, Bel's prince. Hananiah, beloved by the Lord, to Shadrach, illumined by sun god. Mishael, who is as God, to Meshach, who is like Venus. Azariah, the Lord is my help, to Abednego, servant of Nego. The purpose of the food, names, and education was simple: total indoctrination, and a leaving behind of the Hebrew God and culture. Undoubtedly, Nebuchadnezzar wanted to communicate to these young men, "Look to me for everything." Daniel and his friends refused, insisting to look to God. Calvin says that Nebuchadnezzar knew that the Jews were a stiff-necked and obstinate people, and that he used the sumptuous food to soften up these captives. In the same way, Satan wants to indoctrinate us into the world system. He wants us to feed on what the world offers, to identify or name ourselves according to the world, and to educate ourselves in the ways of the world. Daniel chapter 1, verse 8. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Daniel and his friends refused to eat the king's food. Daniel's decision to be faithful. The word for defile himself carries the thought of polluting, staining, defiling. See also Isaiah 59, verse 3, Zephaniah 3, verse 1, and Malachi 1, verse 7. That Daniel requested that he might not defile himself implies that he explained the religious basis for his request. He didn't justify what he was doing on the basis of good health or any other thing except godliness. Wine was not forbidden by God, but in pagan cultures, like many meats, it was dedicated to the gods. Why would Daniel and his friends consider the king's food defiled? Undoubtedly, it was not kosher. It was probably sacrificed to idols. It implied fellowship with Babylon's cultural system. By Eastern standards, to share a meal was to commit oneself to friendship. It was of covenant significance. Why this was such a courageous decision? The king had ordered the menu. To disobey could result in very severe punishment. The food itself was no doubt pretty attractive and seemed pretty good compared to vegetables and water for 3 years. Separated from family and home, it would have been easy to compromise. It would have been easy to think that God had let them down by allowing them to be carried away into Babylon. Why should they risk their necks for a God who let them down? Many Christians have a mentality that says, God, you do right by me, and I'll do right by you. Of course, God will always do right by us, but we don't always know what is right for us. Daniel illustrates to us how to resist temptation. The heart must be set. Daniel purposed in his heart, making up his mind beforehand that he would not compromise. The life must be winning. Daniel found favor with his superiors. Protest must be courteous. Daniel requested. He made a polite request, showing discretion. Making an obedient stand for Jesus Christ does not mean we must be obnoxious. Self-denial must be sought. Be ready for a bad name. Be willing to be called a bigot. Be prepared for the loss of friendships. Be prepared for anything so long as you can stand fast by him who bought you with his precious blood. The test must be boldly put. A Christian man should be willing to be tried. He should be pleased to let his religion be put to the test. There, says he, hammer away if you like. Do you want to be carried to heaven on a feather bed? Daniel chapter 1, verse 9. Now God has brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of eunuchs. The result of Daniel's courageous decision. What God did. God gives Daniel favor and goodwill with the authorities. God will never abandon us when we stand for him. God moved upon the authorities to regard Daniel with goodwill, but also worked through the wise actions of Daniel to cultivate this goodwill. Daniel chapter 1, verse 10. And the prince of the eunuchs said unto Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who hath appointed your meat and your drink. For why should he see your faces worse liking than the children which are of your sort? Then shall ye make me endanger my head to the king. Daniel chapter 1, verse 11. Then said Daniel to Melzar, whom the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Daniel chapter 1, verse 12. Prove thy servants, I beseech thee, 10 days, and let them give us pulse to eat and water to drink. Daniel chapter 1, verse 13. Then let our countenances be looked upon before thee, and the countenance of the children that eat of the portion of the king's meat, and as thou seest, deal with thy servants. What Daniel did. Daniel wisely, and with great trust in God, suggests a plan. He was sensitive to seeing the situation through the steward's eyes, and addressing his legitimate concerns. Martyrs by proxy, who have such strong convictions that they think if someone else's duty to run risk for them, are by no means unknown. Vegetables refer to all kinds of grain and plant, not strictly vegetables. Daniel was willing to put himself and his faith in God to the test. Daniel chapter 1, verse 14. So he consented them in this matter, and proved them 10 days. Daniel chapter 1, verse 15. And at the end of 10 days their countenances appeared fairer and fatter in flesh than all the children which did eat the portion of the king's meat. Daniel chapter 1, verse 16. Thus Melzar took away their portion of the meat and the wine that they should drink, and gave them pulse. The primary result? Immediately, Daniel and his companions are blessed for their faithfulness. Daniel chapter 1, verse 17. As for these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Daniel chapter 1, verse 18. Now at the end of the days that the king had said he should bring them in, then the prince of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel chapter 1, verse 19. And the king communed with them, and among them all was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore stood they before the king. Daniel chapter 1, verse 20. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king required of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in all his realm. Daniel chapter 1, verse 21. And Daniel continued even unto the 1st year of King Cyrus. The secondary result? In the long term, Daniel and his companions are blessed and promoted because of their faithfulness. The special intellectual ability of Daniel and his companions was not due to their diet, but to the special intervention of the Lord. These young men from Jerusalem were immersed in the study of Babylonian culture, literature, and religion, yet they remained faithful to God. The work of the prophets like Jeremiah, Zephaniah, and Habakkuk had not been in vain. They were in the world, but not of it. Observations? Isn't Daniel making a big deal over a little thing? Yes, but the only way to go on with God is by being faithful in little things. Daniel, why bring religion into it? But Daniel realized that his relationship with God touched every area of his life, even what he ate. It is significant that the very roots of sin go back to eating of forbidden fruit. Purity of heart and faithfulness to God come before enlightenment in divine mysteries. Daniel will later receive great revelation, but now he simply shows himself a dedicated follower of God. Daniel and his friends must have been trained well by their parents. We must train our children this way. Daniel chapter 2. Daniel chapter 2, verse 1. And in the 2nd year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar dreamed dreams, wherewith his spirit was troubled, and his sleep brake from him. Nebuchadnezzar's dream. The troubling dream. Some commentators say that this happened while Daniel was in his 3-year training course. Others say that it was soon after he was finished. The year 602, by Babylonian methods of dating the ascension of a king, could be both the second of Nebuchadnezzar's reign and after 3 years of training for the Hebrew youths. There was something disturbing about this dream, and Nebuchadnezzar knew it was unusually significant. Daniel chapter 2, verse 2. Then the king commanded to call the magicians, and the astrologers, and the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans, for to shew the king his dreams. So they came and stood before the king. Daniel chapter 2, verse 3. And the king said unto them, I have dreamed a dream, and my spirit was troubled to know the dream. Daniel chapter 2, verse 4. Then spake the Chaldeans to the king in Syriac, O king, live forever. Tell thy servants the dream, and we will shew you the interpretation. Daniel chapter 2, verse 5. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, The thing is gone from me. If ye will not make it known unto me the dream, with the interpretation thereof, ye shall be cut in pieces, and your house shall be made a dunghill. Daniel chapter 2, verse 6. But if ye shew the dream and the interpretation thereof, you shall receive of me gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore, shew me the dream and the interpretation thereof. Daniel chapter 2, verse 7. They answered again and said, Let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will show you the interpretation. Daniel chapter 2, verse 8. The king answered and said, I know of certainty that ye would gain the time, because ye see the thing is gone from me. Daniel chapter 2, verse 9. But if ye will not make known unto me the dream, there is but one decree for you, for ye have prepared lying and corrupt words to speak before me, till the time be changed. Therefore tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can shew me the interpretation thereof. Nebuchadnezzar demands to know the dream and its interpretation from his wise men. It is hard to say if Nebuchadnezzar really remembered the dream or not. He may have had a sense of it, but have been fuzzy on remembering the details. Nebuchadnezzar had no criteria by which to judge the accuracy of their interpretation, but could test their ability to tell what he had dreamed. In fact, it was the business of these wise men to be able to contact the divine and get secrets from the spirit realm. The harsh posture of Nebuchadnezzar, as well as the method of execution he describes, is perfectly consistent with an ancient Eastern monarch. Archer describes one method of dismemberment. The victim was tied to 4 trees with a rope at each limb. The trees were bent inwards and tied together at the top. The top rope was cut, and the body was snapped into 4 pieces. Daniel chapter 2, verse 10. The Chaldeans answered before the king and said, There is not a man upon the earth that can show the king's matter. Therefore there is no king, lord, nor ruler that asks such things at any magician or astrologer or Chaldean. Daniel chapter 2, verse 11. And it is a rare thing that the king requires, and there is none other that can show it before the king, except the gods whose dwelling is not with flesh. These wise men explain the impossibility of Nebuchadnezzar's request, and in so doing, they confess that true revelation comes from God down to man. It is not the achievement of man. The strategy of the wise men was to convince the king that he was being unreasonable, not that they were being incompetent. They were like some modern ministers of our own day who spend their time studying philosophy, psychiatry, psychology, social science, political science, and then continue under the pretense of being God's messenger to men. Daniel chapter 2, verse 12. For this cause the king was angry and very furious, and commanded to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. Daniel chapter 2, verse 13. And the decree went forth that the wise men should be slain, and they sought Daniel and his fellows to be slain. A furious Nebuchadnezzar sentences all his wise men to death. Nebuchadnezzar, though a despot, knew that false religion was worse than useless. It was a curse. As a new king, Nebuchadnezzar may have been using this situation to test the suitability of his father's old advisors. They seem to be lacking. Daniel chapter 2, verse 14. Then Daniel answered with counsel and wisdom to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, which was gone forth to slay the wise men of Babylon. Daniel chapter 2, verse 15. He answered and said to Arioch, the king's captain, Why is the decree so hasty from the king? Then Arioch made the thing known to Daniel. Daniel chapter 2, verse 16. Then Daniel went in and desired of the king that he would give him time, and that he should show the king the interpretation. God reveals the dream to Daniel. Daniel reacts to Nebuchadnezzar's decree by asking for a brief extension. Daniel is obviously innocent in all this, yet he calmly and discreetly deals with the situation. Daniel's calmness in this crisis showed what kind of man he really was. Crises do not make the man, they reveal the man. He asked the king to give him time. It takes time to listen to the Lord and to wait upon him, and Daniel knew this. Was Satan trying to manufacture Daniel's execution in all this? Daniel chapter 2, verse 17. Then Daniel went to his house and made the thing known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions. Daniel chapter 2, verse 18. That they would desire mercies of the God of heaven concerning this secret, that Daniel and his fellows should not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Daniel asks his companions for prayer. Daniel was in the type of situation where God truly works, one of human impossibility with the stress on urgency. The battle was won when Daniel prayed with his friends. It is a privilege to have praying friends. In prayer meetings such as this, history has been made. No doubt, their prayers were extremely earnest, and God listens to earnest prayer. Daniel has confidence that God could do an unprecedented miracle. Joseph had interpreted dreams with God's help, but had not reconstructed the dreams. Daniel chapter 2, verse 19. Then was the secret revealed unto Daniel in a night vision. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. God reveals Nebuchadnezzar's dream and its interpretation to Daniel. This was not religion, but revelation. It came as a night vision. A dream, a vision at night. Daniel chapter 2, verse 20. Daniel answered and said, Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his. Daniel chapter 2, verse 21. And he changeth the times and the seasons. He removeth kings, and setteth up kings. He giveth wisdom unto the wise, and knowledge to them that know understanding. Daniel chapter 2, verse 22. He revealeth the deep and secret things. He knoweth what is in the darkness, and the light dwelleth with him. Daniel chapter 2, verse 23. I thank thee and praise thee, O thou God of my fathers, who hast given me wisdom and might, and hast made known unto me now what we desired of thee. For thou hast now made known unto us the king's matter. Daniel's praise to God for this revelation. God is praised for his might and for his desire to speak to man. Daniel has the certainty of faith to believe that God has given him the answer, even when he has not confirmed it before Nebuchadnezzar yet. Daniel chapter 2, verse 24. Therefore Daniel went in unto Arioch, whom the king had ordered to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and said thus unto him, Destroy not the wise men of Babylon. Bring me in before the king, and I will show unto the king the interpretation. Daniel chapter 2, verse 25. Then Arioch brought in Daniel before the king in haste, and said thus unto him, I have found a man of the captives of Judah, that will make known unto the king the interpretation. Daniel chapter 2, verse 26. The king answered and said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, Art thou able to make known unto me the dream which I have seen, and the interpretation thereof? Daniel chapter 2, verse 27. Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, The secret which the king hath demanded cannot the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, the soothsayers show unto the king. Daniel chapter 2, verse 28. But there is a God in heaven that revealeth secrets, and maketh known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in the latter days. Thy dream and the visions of thy head upon thy bed are these. Daniel chapter 2, verse 29. As for thee, O king, thy thoughts came into thy mind upon thy bed, what shall come to pass hereafter, and he that revealeth secrets make known to thee what shall come to pass. Daniel chapter 2, verse 30. But as for me, this secret is not revealed to me for any wisdom that I have more than any living, but for their sakes that shall make known the interpretation to the king, and that thou mightest know the thoughts of thy heart. The dream of Nebuchadnezzar and its interpretation. Daniel is ushered into the king's presence and gives glory to God for revealing the dream. Arioch tries to glorify himself and Daniel in verse 25, I have found a man. But Daniel gives all the glory to God in verse 28, in contrast to the Babylonian gods. Daniel chapter 2, verse 31. Thou, O king, sawest and beheld a great image. This great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible. Daniel chapter 2, verse 32. This image's head was of fine gold, his breast and his arms of silver, his belly and his thighs of brass. Daniel chapter 2, verse 33. His legs of iron, his feet part of iron and part of clay. Daniel chapter 2, verse 34. Thou sawest till that a stone was cut out without hands, which smote the image upon his feet, that were of iron and clay, and brake them into pieces. Daniel chapter 2, verse 35. Then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, and the gold broken to pieces together, and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away, that no place was found for them. And the stone that smote the image became a great mountain, and filled the whole earth. The dream is described by Daniel. Daniel's description is clear. This is a massive image, or statue, made of different materials. The image is destroyed by a stone made without hands, and is blown away like worthless chaff, while the stone comes to dominate the whole earth. Daniel chapter 2, verse 36. This is the dream. and we will tell the interpretation thereof before the king. Daniel chapter 2, verse 37. Thou, O king, art a king of kings, for the God of heaven hath given thee a kingdom, power, and strength, and glory. Daniel chapter 2, verse 38. And wheresoever the children of men dwell, the beasts of the field and the fowls of the earth hath he given into thine hand, and hath made thee ruler over them all. Thou art this head of gold. Daniel chapter 2, verse 39. And after thee shall arise another kingdom inferior to thee, and another third kingdom of brass, which shall bear rule over all the earth. Daniel chapter 2, verse 40. And the fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron, for as much as iron breaketh in pieces and subdueth all things, and as iron that breaketh all these, shall it break in pieces and bruise. Daniel chapter 2, verse 41. And whereas thou sawest the feet and the toes, part of potter's clay and part of iron, the kingdom shall be divided, but there shall be in it of the strength of the iron, for as much as thou sawest the iron mixed with the miry clay. Daniel chapter 2, verse 42. And as the toes of the feet were part of iron and part of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken. Daniel chapter 2, verse 43. And whereas thou sawest iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, but they shall not cleave one to another, even as iron is not mixed with clay. Daniel chapter 2, verse 44. And in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom, which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. Daniel chapter 2, verse 45. For as much as thou sawest that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it brake in pieces the iron, the brass, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God hath made known to the king what shall come to pass hereafter, and the dream is certain, and the interpretation thereof sure. The interpretation of the dream. Nebuchadnezzar is clearly said to be the head of gold. After him will come 3 other kingdoms, then the final kingdom set up by God. The empires succeeding Babylon were the Medo-Persian, the Greek, and the Roman. They are inferior not in the sense of size or duration, quite the opposite, but in the sense of centralization of absolute power. The metals become less valuable and weighty according to specific gravity, but they do become stronger. In value, we see a devolution, not evolution. Babylonia stood for 66 years, Medo-Persia for 208 years, Greece 185 years, and Rome was so strong that it stood for more than 500 years. Note the distinction between the feet and the legs. The feet seem to describe a confederation of kings, during which Jesus will establish his kingdom on earth. Since there is no fulfillment of this federation of kings, which seems to number 10 because of the number of toes, and passages like Daniel chapter 7 verse 24 and Revelation chapter 17 verse 12. In ancient Roman history, this prophecy must still be future. Therefore, the final superpower of the world is thought to be a revival of the Roman Empire, a continuation of the image. This will be the final world empire that the returning Jesus will conquer over. Analysis. This is a human image representing man's rule in this earth. That day will end. This is an amazing prophecy. God can tell us the future because he controls all of history. We do well to remember that Rome was nothing but a little village on the banks of the Tiber when Nebuchadnezzar dreamed his dream. Liberal scholars do not believe that the fourth kingdom is Rome, but they say it is Greece, and that the second and third kingdoms are Media and Persia respectively. instead of the Medo-Persian Empire as a whole. They interpret this way because they believe that it would have been impossible for Daniel, writing in the Maccabean period, of course, to predict the Roman Empire. Daniel chapter 2, verse 46. Then the king Nebuchadnezzar fell upon his face and worshipped Daniel, and commanded that they should offer an oblation and sweet odors unto him. Daniel chapter 2, verse 47. The king answered unto Daniel and said, Of a truth it is, that your God is a God of gods, and a Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets, seeing that thou couldest reveal the secret. Daniel chapter 2, verse 48. Then the king made Daniel a great man, and gave him many great gifts, and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and chief of the governors over all the wise men of Babylon. Daniel chapter 2, verse 49. Then Daniel requested of the king, and he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel sat in the gate of the king. Nebuchadnezzar reacts by praising Daniel, his God, and by promoting Daniel and his friends. It is fitting that Daniel's friends, who had accomplished much of the victory through their prayers, get to share in Daniel's advancement.